Greetings and welcome to God Save the King. I am your host, Tim Kies. Thank you for listening to God Save the King on the Truth Be Told radio network, where you can hear my show every Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern Time. Now, God Save the King is my ongoing 30-plus year biblical, historical, and scientific research project devoted to retelling the Nativity story the way it really would have happened. And that, frankly, is because the traditional Nativity story is, in fact, Christian mythology and bears only the vaguest resemblance to what really would have happened. So open your eyes, open your ears, open your mind, open your Bibles, and maybe the Nativity doesn't look quite like we think it does. Now, if you appreciate content like this, we would appreciate it if you would like, follow, and subscribe to my posts and my videos, both on the Truth Be Told Radio Network website and on my website, as well as our social media, YouTube, Facebook, Twitch, Rumble, etc., etc. So please go to those sites, like the posts, and subscribe. My website is www.godsavetheking.org, and Truth Be Told Network is www.truthbetoldnetwork.org. And there's a lot of different ways that you can listen to my show on the Truth Be Told Radio Network. You can go directly to their website that I just gave you the address for and click on the big listen button. But you can also listen to it through your smart devices, right? Your phone is a smart device, as well as, Alexa, Google, and Apple, home devices. Smart pod speakers and stuff like that, where you can say, hey, Alexa, listen to Truth Be Told Radio Network, or hey, Google, listen to Truth Be Told Radio Network. And there's a variety of apps that you can use, Wi-Fi radio, TuneIn Radio, MyTuner, Android, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, last but certainly not least, we are available as a podcast. So if you go to anchor.com, go to Anchor, Audible, Amazon, different places, you can find the Truth Be Told Radio Network as a podcast and select God Save the King. And I said last but not least, but actually last but not least is that you can actually dial in on your phone. So if you don't have these other methods available to you, you can call in and listen. If you dial 641-741-2866 or 717-567-4977, you can dial in and you can listen to my show and the other great shows that are on the Truth Be Told Radio Network. Now, what I want to do today is something a little bit different. If this is the first time you're listening to my show, I encourage you to continue listening because I think you're really going to enjoy what you're going to hear today. And if you've been listening to me before, if you've listened to my show before, there's going to be a little repetition today, but I think you're going to enjoy today's show, because really what I'm going for today is, why should you listen to God Save the King? Why should you listen to the show, and why should you, frankly, continue listening to my show? So what I'm after here today is some background, as well as an outline and a summary behind God Save the King, that gives you in one shot, in one sitting, right? 1 60-minute session. Why should you keep listening? Frankly, what I want to do is I want to wet your whistle. I want to whet your appetite and get you going, oh man, I want to tune in again. I want to hear what he has to say next. So what I want to start with is a little bit of the background of how God Save the King got started about 35 years ago, and then what happened between then and now that has resulted in the videos that I'm recording, the radio show that I'm doing, the research that I continue to do, planned trips to the Bible lands to research this stuff on site and things like that. We have a lot of things brewing, a lot of things that we want to accomplish and continue to give this information to you so that you can get a better understanding of what the Nativity looked like. Okay. So this all started back in the mid 1980s, and I've done this before, so let me do it again. In the mid 1980s, late 1985, early 1986, I was introduced to a book called The Birth of Christ Recalculated by a man named Ernest Martin. He was the author of that book. Now, it was originally published in 1980, and like I said, I read it in like late 85, early 86. The Birth of Christ Recalculated, Foundation for Biblical Research Publishers, based out of Pasadena, California. Okay. Now, just so you are aware, Mr. Martin, Dr. Martin, updated that book and retitled it and then re-released it in 1996 as The Star That Astonished the World. Okay. And now this is by Ask Publications based out of Portland, Oregon. And it remains one of the best books on the subject to this day. But, and not to get ahead of myself too quickly, but we've also learned a lot more since then, right? So, and there'll be more on this in a minute because I don't want to get ahead of myself, right? But the first book I ever read was The Birth of Christ Recalculated, published in 1980 and then re-released in 1996 as The Star That Astonished the World. And this was the book that introduced me to the hypothesis that Jesus of Nazareth was not born on December 25th. Now, at that time, that was pretty controversial. Not so much today, because that's at least 25, if not 35 or 40 years after the book was written is what we're looking at now. So a lot has happened in that period of time. And with this type of research in general, one of the things you always have to remember, and it's a huge disclaimer that I frankly should repeat more often than I do, is that a huge disclaimer of my project and of my work is that I reserve the right to change my mind. This is an ongoing project. And if new research reveals new developments, then I want to share those with you. And I'll be the first one to say, well, you know what? I had that wrong. I wasn't quite seeing that correctly. And we've got new information that now allows us to see that it probably looked like this, right? If I get a minute later on, I'll show you one particular detail of the Nativity story that frankly I've gone back and forth on 2 or 3 times because of the new information that I've discovered. But like I said, I really don't want to get ahead of myself. So mid-1980s, read The Birth of Christ Recalculated, same book, updated, really released mid-90s, called The Star That Astonished the World. The author is Ernest L. Martin, still one of the best books on this subject to this day. Now, but I was not the only person in my circle of ministry reading this book at that time. There were many other ministers and laymen alike reading this book at that time and going, oh my God, this is amazing. All right. Now, one of the other people that was reading that book happened to be my brother Dan. And if you've listened to my show before, several episodes ago, I did kind of an homage to my brother. My brother passed away several weeks ago, and he had his own research that he was doing into this project. It's why he was reading the book at the same time I was. I was reading it almost exclusively from a Bible study perspective. He was reading it from also for that perspective as well, but also because Dan was a playwright and had been commissioned to write a multi-episode dramatic series about the life and ministry of Jesus Christ, including his birth. Okay. So here he gets commissioned to write these plays. And the first thought that hits him is, well, how do I tell the story? How do I tell this story? Because it's a story that everybody already knows. So how do I put a dramatic production up on stage, or eventually, hopefully on television or in a movie or a miniseries? How do I put this on screen or on stage in a way that's going to be exciting and relevant because of the ubiquity, right? The ubiquitousness, if I can invent a word, right? Which means that ubiquitous means something is just everywhere you look, right? The ubiquitousness of the traditional nativity story. So, I mean, every year at quote unquote Christmas time, there's the Christmas play, right? And it's in our church, it's in our Bible studies. Sometimes it's even in our public schools, although not so much anymore, right? But they're everywhere, and nativity scenes and Christmas cards and Christmas carols. And because of the overwhelming nature of the tradition, okay, how do you tell that story? This was my brother's question. How do you tell that story in a way that's actually going to be interesting? Because everybody's going to go, oh yeah, ho hum, already know it, been there, done that, know the story. Why should I pay attention, right? Well, what he came up with, which I thought was quite brilliant at the time, is he said, well, what if we tell the story instead of as just a kind of third party outside observer? Why don't we tell it almost in the first person through the eyes of someone involved? So in other words, why don't we tell the story through the eyes of the shepherds? Or why don't we tell the story through the eyes of the wise men, the magi? Or frankly, why don't we tell the story through the eyes of Herod the Great, the Roman appointed client king of Judea at that time? And this was a great idea because it gave new flavor to how can you look at the nativity story, right? And frankly, this is how we came up with the title, God Save the King. Excuse me here one sec. Pardon me, need a cough button on my mixer here. This is how we came up with the title, God Save the King, because when you look at the nativity story from the perspective of Herod the Great, one of the things you find out relatively quickly was that Herod was not a Jew. He was a tyrant, and he was obsessed / paranoid about keeping his throne and remaining in power. But as part of Herod's backstory, he married, quote unquote, legitimate, we'll talk about that in a minute, quote unquote, legitimate Judean royalty, which meant that his wives and children had a better claim to the throne than he did, because they were at least Jewish. Whether or not they were of the right tribe or not was another story, because they came from a priestly family, which tends to indicate the tribe of Levi, when the reality of it is that the royalty needed to come through the line of David. But we'll do that another time, and we have done that another time, and we'll do it again another time, right? But he married into the Hasmoneans, the Maccabees, that family that had been ruling Judea since the middle of the 2nd century BC. So he married a Hasmonean princess, and they were regarded as the kings and queens and royalty of Judea at that time. So he married into the royal family, but like I said, that means that his wives and children, his sons, had better claim to the throne than he did. So he became obsessed and almost paranoid, maybe straight up paranoid, about keeping his throne against anybody who would challenge it. And that meant his own wives and children. And as we know, he murdered at least one of his own wives and several of his own sons to prevent them from taking the throne, because Herod faced unending political intrigues in his court and in his family. Now, some of them, like his sister, right? His sister was just trying to get what she saw as her fair share, quote unquote, right? She didn't necessarily want to be queen, but she absolutely believed, hey, wait a second, you know, I'm part of this Game of Thrones, right? The parallels to Game of Thrones are stunning, because this is actual historical fact, and this surrounds Jesus Christ. So this is the penultimate Game of Thrones, at least in the earthly realm, right? But Herod faced unending political intrigues in his court and in his family. Like I said, some of them were just trying to get what they perceived as their fair share, whereas others believed they should replace Herod, that they should be on the throne, right? And so this is where it was, frankly, my brother Dan who came up with the title God Save the King, because God Save the King is a pun, okay, deliberately intended to be a pun, because when we say God Save the King, which king are we talking about? Are we talking about the pretender king, the client king appointed by the Romans never capable of being a legitimate king, King Herod, who was undoubtedly surrounded by yes men who said, "Oh, great king, live forever. God save the king," right? Or are we talking about Jesus of Nazareth, a king forever from the line, from the house and lineage of David, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Mashiach Nagid, the king of Israel, right? Jesus Christ. Okay. Yeshua HaMashiach, right? Who are we talking about? Okay. It's kind of obvious, but that's the whole point of the title, is that it's tongue-in-cheek, it's a play on words, it's a pun that is designed to get you to think about the context, like we talked about last week. Context, context, context. We have missed both the micro and the macro context of this story for so long that we fail to see what an amazing, amazing, amazing story this really is. Whether you're simply looking at Joseph, Mary, and Jesus, which that alone is an incredible story. But then when you include Herod, when you include the wise men, when you include Augustus, I mean, these are all components that are mentioned in the story. There was, in the days of Herod the king, a decree that went out from Caesar Augustus saying that all the world should be registered. Okay, well, that makes this a true Game of Thrones, an international political thriller. Okay, so now this was the perspective 25 to 30 to 35 years ago when we were presented with the hypothesis that Jesus was not born on December 25th. Our immediate hypothesis was, how do we tell the story in a new way, in a fresh way, because, quote unquote, everybody already knows it. Well, that hypothesis, as good as it was, because it was a good premise to build off of, that in turn revealed critical errors on our part, right? And like I said, I'm not the only one who was reading this at the time, right? So I made this mistake, my brother made this mistake, and everybody else I knew who was reading this book at this time made the same mistake, which is that number. And I'm going to put it in three statements, right? It's one mistake, but it manifests itself in three statements, because let me throw this in really quickly before I say that. Because we have assumed for decades and generations that the Christmas story, that's where we have gotten our information from, Christmas resources. And I'm using air quotes for those of you that can't see me on video. Okay. We have always assumed that Jesus was born on December 25th, or at least thereabouts, that therefore he was born in winter, and that therefore the Christmas pageants, the Christmas plays, the nativity scenes, and the Christmas carols. Here we go. So now I'm going to say it's one error, but I'm going to express it in three critical ways. Number one, we assumed we already knew the story. We assumed it. We didn't check. We didn't do our homework. We assumed we already knew the story because of, once again, the ubiquity, the fact that the traditional nativity story is everywhere. It's in your face every year, telling you this is the story, this is the story, this is the story. The carols say so. The nativity scene says so. Your church play says so. Your kids' nativity play says so. Everybody is telling you this is the story. So we assumed we already knew the story, and we didn't do our due diligence. Another thing we assumed is that we assumed that the traditional version of the nativity story was biblically, historically, and scientifically accurate and valid. That was another assumption. It's wrapped up in the other assumption, but like I said, one error expressed in three ways. And so then the third way is that while we recognized that the birth date may not have been correct, and we were ready, willing, and able to change the birth date, we did not initially recognize that by changing the birth date, you're going to change the story, right? We assumed that even though the birth date changed, that the story didn't really change, right? Okay, so now I need to tell you at this point that if you're new to this, if you haven't listened to me before, right? If you're listening to me live on TBTRN on Friday night at 10:21 p.m., okay, East Coast, Eastern Time, right? If you're listening to this, or if you're on YouTube and you managed to find my page and you're watching me and listening to this, I'm not here to ruin your fun, and I'm not here to ruin your traditions necessarily. and I say that tongue in cheek because I really, truly believe. Now, I have the benefit of 35 years of slowly and incrementally changing my mind. And I'm dumping this on you in a matter of no more than 60 minutes and maybe even 5 or 10 minutes that you're getting smacked upside the head with this revelation that no, he wasn't born on December 25th, and no, the traditional nativity story is full of errors, full of them, right? Now, there's some stuff that's correct, and we're going to talk about that too. But like I said, I'm not necessarily here to ruin your fun and ruin your traditions, but over 35 years of research, I discovered that each of these premises that we just discussed, right, that we assumed that we already knew the story, we assumed that the story was biblically, historically, and scientifically accurate, and we assumed that although the birth date changed, that the essential components of the story didn't change. And every one of those is wrong. 35 years of research I have discovered that each of those premises is incorrect, right? The traditional nativity story does not hold up to biblical, historical, or scientific scrutiny, which is now, after 35 years of research, I'm sorry to be offensive. I know I'm going to offend some of you out there. It's not my intention, but this is why, after 35 years of research, I am not remotely afraid to call the traditional nativity story what it is, which is Christian mythology, because it has so many errors that it just simply cannot stand up anymore. You can't turn to it as being biblically valid, because it's just not. It's just not. There's too many significant errors, right? So at first, I kind of followed in my brother's footsteps, because now he managed. So the funny thing is he managed to produce one play. That was it. From the Eyes of the Shepherds. And that was it. It's called Glory to God in the Highest. It was produced back in the mid-1980s, and it was the only one he ever got done because things happened, things changed, and the remainder of the series felt that he was commissioned to produce fell through. Okay. So he did produce one. And like I said, I grabbed onto what his premise of telling it through the eyes of a different character, right, as just a really good way of bringing a fresh look at the story, right? That, like we said, we assumed that the story didn't really change, but maybe I can get some fresh perspective by looking at it through the eyes of the shepherds. Because after all, why did God choose the shepherds of all people, right? Okay, is it because they effectively represent every man, which I think is pretty accurate, right? That they're just Joe Blue Collar, doing their job. So they represent everybody. They represent every man. That's one reason why I believe that. But there's a lot of other reasons why did he choose shepherds? Because there's a whole slew of notable biblical characters that were shepherds. And then, of course, Jesus himself is called the Great Shepherd, right? So if you're one of these odd people, and I'm definitely one of them, that believes that every detail of the Bible is there for a reason, then why shepherds, right? And then why magi? Why the wise men? Boy, now is that a question to ask, right? Because they're Gentiles. They're not Jews, and yet they read in the stars of all things that the king of Judea had been born from 600 miles away, and they travel, and they're willing to travel 600 miles on horseback, right? Not camels, sorry, horses, right? It was a horse culture. The Parthian culture was a horse culture, right? They travel 600 miles. They waltz right into the court of Herod the Great, a Roman appointed king. And these are Parthians. This is the enemy, right? We're going to talk more about that in a minute. And they ride right into Herod's court. And imagine the cojones on these guys that they had to say, that they said, where is he who is born King of the Jews? I mean, they waltzed right into Herod's court and said, hey, we recognize the fact that you're not a legitimate king. Where is the legitimate king, right? And then, of course, then there's Herod, right? And the fact that he had all this political intrigue in his court. So, kind of repeating myself, but what I discovered over 35 years of research is that I would expose an error, correct that error, but then in the process, expose another error. Okay, and then I'd correct that error, and then in the process, expose another error, and then correct that error, etc., 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 etc. And it produced so much of a domino effect that I eventually came to the point that I've already talked about, that I said, wait, oh my God, wait a second. The traditional nativity story is untenable. It doesn't work like hardly at all. Like I keep saying, there's some broad strokes that are correct. Joseph and Mary definitely traveled from Nazareth to Bethlehem. That's okay. Jesus was definitely wrapped in swaddling clothes and laid in a manger, right? He was definitely visited by shepherds. He was definitely visited by wise men. And Herod absolutely tried to kill the young child and did kill male children in and around Bethlehem, despite what the cynics and the critics want to say, right? And they definitely fled to Egypt. And then after Herod died, they came back from Egypt. So those broad strokes are correct. It's the details that are different, and it's the details that radically change the story in a way that is truly significant and makes the traditional story untenable, right? So like I said, what I discovered over 35 years of research was this: expose the error, correct the error, expose another error, domino effect, right? And then, as I've already mentioned, research of this nature is progressive. We continue to discover. We continue to learn. I reserve the right to change my mind. And like I said, if we get the time before we leave today and before we run out, I want to share with you one little detail where I've gone back and forth about 5 times on this one particular detail, because I kept learning new things. Okay? So we'll get to that in a second, right? And then another thing I realized over time is how profound and significant and frankly prophetic in a way the title that my brother came up with is God Save the King. Because as it turns out, there is a truckload of political intrigue going on all around this story. So God Save the King this was not a coincidence that we came up with that title and that I grabbed onto it as the name of my project and the name of my ministry. I mean, immediately after my brother invented it, it was like, okay, I'm grabbing that. I'm sorry, I'm stealing that and I'm taking it. And I've called my ministry God Save the King ever since. Okay, so it really is Game of Thrones on steroids, because this actually happened. This isn't fiction. This is truth. This is reality. This is history. And it's his story surrounding the Messiah of Israel, the Mashiach Nagid, Jesus of Nazareth. Okay, really is Game of Thrones. So I'll give you a quick taste of that, right? Your average Christian knows next to nothing about the Parthian Empire. Okay, now if you're listening to me for the first time and you've never heard of the Parthian Empire, you're a perfect example. You're going, the what? The who? The who? The what? The what empire? The Parthian Empire. The Parthian Empire. See, now I was raised in church. And when I was in high school, right, I went whatever church my girlfriend went to, I went to, right? okay, because I wanted to hang out with my girlfriend, right? But I was still curious, and I was still listening to whatever preacher, teacher, minister, or whatever was in the pulpit. I was paying attention. I was listening because I wanted to know. I was raised in the faith, and I wanted to believe, and I wanted to know more, right? Not once, no one ever mentioned the Parthian Empire. I went to Bible college and graduated from Bible college without hearing about the Parthian Empire. Okay? It was only in my postgraduate studies, and frankly, my studies on my own, just straight up me on my own, frankly, led by the Holy Spirit, that I went, who are these guys? Who are the Parthians, right? Well, they are the superpower, the empire immediately to the east of Judea. Okay? And they were Rome's enemy. So everybody knows about the Roman Empire, or at least is aware of the Roman Empire, but your average Christian has never heard of the Parthian Empire. And this is where the Magi came from, right? And like I said, they were Rome's enemy, right? So also your average Christian, now they may know a little bit, okay, about the Maccabees, also known as the Hasmoneans, okay? So these were the Judean pseudo-royalty that reigned over the kingdom of Judea beginning in the middle of the 2nd century BC, okay? And go to my website, go to my YouTube page, watch my videos. I give you all the historical background that led up to the Maccabees taking control of this fledgling little kingdom of Judea in the middle of the 2nd century BC. Right? But the Maccabees, the Hasmoneans, they had political intrigue within their royal court and within their family that over no more than about 100 years precipitated a civil war between two princes over the throne. Two sons of the same mother fought each other over the throne of Judea, right? Now, each one at first turned to the Romans for political support. And at the time, that would have been Pompey Magnus, Pompey the Great, okay, because he would have been the Roman ruler of the Near East at that time, okay? So at that time, they appealed to Pompey for political support. But when Pompey made his decision of one brother over the other brother who got snubbed, he turned to the Parthians for help. Okay? So as a result, the Parthians, well, just like the Romans, they wanted to see someone on the throne of Judea who would be beneficial to them, right? So the Parthians said, sure, we'll help. So what did the Parthians do? They invaded Judea. They invaded Judea in order to throw off the Romans and the Roman appointed king / high priest and install their own king / high priest, right? And these are two brothers. Like I said, these are two brothers. So you've got political intrigue in the Maccabeans, in the Hasmoneans, right? So this truly is God Save the King. This is all Game of Thrones, right? Like I said. So when the Parthians invaded, Herod had just been appointed only a few years earlier. Herod had been appointed governor of Galilee, okay? His brother Faisal had been appointed governor of Judea. Their father Antipater was a court official in the court of Hyrcanus II, who was the Roman choice to be the high priest of Judea at that time. But historians are pretty universally agreed that Hyrcanus wasn't really the power. It was really Antipater, right? Who was simply a court official, but he was the true friend of Rome. He was the one really pulling the strings. And like I said, he had succeeded in getting one of his sons appointed governor of Judea and another of his sons appointed governor of Galilee. Now that governor of Galilee, that's Herod. That's his son Herod, right? So now the Parthians invade, and to make a long story short, everything goes sideways at that point when the Parthians invade. The best laid plans of these men, they get turned on their head, and they've got to figure something out. So Hyrcanus And Faisal went to negotiate with the Parthians, and Faisal winds up dead. Hyrcanus winds up disfigured, which means he can't serve as high priest anymore. Herod flees first to the city of Petra in Nabatea, looking for help there. Then he goes to Alexandria, Egypt, looking for Marcus Antonius, Mark Antony, right? Who is his personal friend, by the way. They know each other, and they have actually fought together prior to this. Okay, so he knows Marcus Antonius. He goes to Petra first, then to Alexandria, because Antony is hanging out with Cleopatra at that time. He's not there, so Cleopatra sends him to Rome. Marcus Antonius introduces him to Octavian, who is, going to become Augustus Caesar. They introduce him to the Roman Senate. They appoint him king of Judea, but the problem is the Parthians have conquered Judea. The Romans don't have it to give. The Romans don't have it to give. So here you go. Once again, this truly is Game of Thrones. God save the king. But what king are we even talking about? What king are we even talking about? Are we talking about Aristobulus II? Are we talking about Hyrcanus II? Are we talking about Pompey? Are we talking about Julius Caesar? Are we talking about Marcus Antonius? Are we talking about Augustus Caesar? Are we talking about Phraates of Parthia? Now, there's a name that no one has heard, right? Unless you've heard my show before, or unless you're a history buff interested in ancient biblical history, have you ever heard of Phraates? Well, Phraates is the king of Parthia at the same time. And of course, there's lots of political intrigue going on in Parthia, right? The Magi, the wise men, one of their responsibilities is that they were responsible for overseeing royal succession. The Parthians actually had a very interesting practice that was not common at that time. Now, this type of political intrigue all throughout antiquity was common, all right? That the fact that, the royal house, the royals, and the nobles were known for their intrigues and for making the competition disappear and, frankly, murdering a challenger to your throne. This was not uncommon at all. I mean, on the Roman side of things, right, you've just had a civil war between Julius Caesar and Pompey, and then Pompey wins, right? Or pardon me, Julius Caesar won. What am I saying? Oh my God. The civil war between Julius Caesar and Pompey, and Julius Caesar wins, effectively becoming the first quote unquote Roman emperor. Now, he wasn't really called emperor. That waited a generation before they truly called the next leader the Roman emperor. But Julius Caesar, becomes the singular head of the Roman Republic at that time. It wasn't the Roman Empire just yet. It was still the Roman Republic, but yet he was, frankly, dictator, right? And so then he gets assassinated, right? So then his friends and political allies and his legal heir, Octavian, who is going to become Augustus Caesar, right? Well, they go after Caesar's assassins and they defeat them in battle. So it's still the ongoing civil war between one side and the other, right? It's just that now Octavian and Marcus Antonius and Lepidus, they defeat Brutus and Crassus at Cassius, rather, at the Battle of Philippi. Okay? And so now they win, right? So then the second triumvirate has to divide up power in the Roman Empire. It's very quickly devolving from republic into empire, right? And Mark Antony is granted control of the East, right? And boy, he mishandles that, right? And as an end result, he winds up in a civil war against Octavian. And then Octavian finally wins, right? So this really, truly is Game of Thrones, God Save the King on all sides. You had massive political intrigue in the Roman Empire leading up to this time. You have political intrigue in the House of Hasmon, the Maccabees up into this time, and then you have political intrigue in the Parthian Empire. So this is to take up where I left off. The Parthians handled things a little differently. So like I said, that kind of intrigue was common, right, in the ancient world, in antiquity. So the Parthians came up with this notion that it was the Magi, the house of Magistanes, that would oversee royal succession. So when the king died, it wasn't automatically his eldest son that became the next king. Okay? So the Magi, they didn't necessarily unilaterally declare the next king, but the idea was supposed to be that they would help determine who the next king would be, because what they would do is that they would consult the genealogies, plus they would read the stars and look for astronomical omens and things like that, because that was something they did, because astronomy and astrology at that time was not really personalized yet. It was starting to become personalized. The idea of a horoscope and a birth chart and that stuff was just starting to come on the scene. But for centuries and millennia prior to this point, astronomy and astrology was exclusively about the nation, okay? It was about the king, okay? That's what astrology was really about, okay? So you have had a history, a several hundred, if not several thousand year history in Mesopotamia up until this point of Mesopotamian celestial observers, wise men observing the stars and then reading the omens to determine who the king is supposed to be and what the king is supposed to do and all that kind of stuff, right? So it's not natal, okay, astrology. That's, birth sky and all that stuff like that. It's this national, international political astrology is something very different, right? So they oversaw royal succession, right? Well, Phraates the Fourth, who is an essential contemporary of Herod, they were very, very close in age. They were about the same age. Phraates murdered, now remember, this is a polygamist culture. Phraates murdered 30 of his own brothers so that he would be the only one left that the Magi could declare king, right? And he has ruled Parthia. And right as you get up to the time of Jesus's birth, Phraates the Fourth dies. So the Parthian Magi who came to the court of Herod the Great, they were legitimately doing their job. It wasn't simply the fact that this bizarre, miraculous star appeared out of nowhere. That isn't what happened at all. It was that the Parthian Magi, the Mesopotamian wise men, celestial observers with a several thousand-year history of this practice, were watching the stars for signs about who the king is supposed to be. And now they've read it in the stars, and they're going to find the king that the stars spoke of. So like I said, the point of all this is that you bring all of this together. This is the backstory that sets up the Nativity story. This is the backstory, the international political intrigue, the Game of Thrones from the Roman Empire, the Parthian Empire, the Maccabees and the House of Hasmon, and then Herod, and then yet in the middle of all this, in this sleepy little village in Galilee called Nazareth, a young couple gets married, and this miraculous thing happens, and she gets told that she is to bear the Messiah, of Israel, Joseph, when he finds out she's pregnant, he blows a gasket initially, right? He's going to divorce her. He's going to leave her. That's it. It's done. You were unfaithful. I'm out of here. I'm gone. But, an angel appears to him in a dream and says, fear not to take unto you Mary as your wife. And man, there are details in that story that we never talk about, okay, that I will discuss in other episodes, right? But in the midst of this massive political intrigue, you've got this much more localized, amazing story, even in its own right, let alone set against this background, right? But they're set against the background, right? And so, like I said, it's in this context. See, so over the years, like I said, we started out with, well, let's look at it through the eyes of the shepherds. Let's look at it through the eyes of the Magi. Let's look at it through the eyes of Herod. Well, over the years, that changed for me, right? And I came up with 3 different categories. Now, they're still very closely interrelated to the 3 original categories. But very simply now, it's the Roman Chronicle, the Parthian Chronicle, and the Judean Chronicle. So those are the 3 points of view that I use now as the overview for the Nativity story. And you've got to set that stage so that now we can look at the period of time between, frankly, 4 BC and 1 BC. There's about a 3.5 year period of time that we want to focus in on from when Elizabeth, from when Joseph and Mary became betrothed, and then Elizabeth becomes pregnant, Mary becomes pregnant, right? Then they both give birth, and Joseph and Mary move to Bethlehem. Okay, so there's a misconception that we need to recover, is that they weren't visiting Bethlehem. They were moving to Bethlehem, right? So none of this back and forth. Sorry, you guys, all you guys that desperately want to say that they went to Bethlehem and then back to Nazareth and back to Bethlehem again. No, they didn't. They moved to Bethlehem. You're missing the point of what Scripture is trying to tell you when it says that they traveled to Bethlehem because they were of the house and lineage of David. That means they were moving. It's not because they had to go there to register. You don't register where you don't live. You register where you live. So that means they were moving. But there you go. That is a perfect example of a detail that we have missed because we have been just so overwhelmed by the tradition that we miss what's right there. Okay? We miss what's right there in front of us. Okay? So once again, so over 35 years, this morphed from, we assumed the traditional nativity story was correct. We assumed that even if the birth date changed, that the details didn't really change, right? We assumed we knew the story. Well, turns out, no, we didn't, because we have been so captivated, and I don't mean that in a good way, I'm sorry. We have been so captivated by distracted, that's the better word, right? We have been so distracted by the traditional nativity story that we missed the real story. And the real story is stunning. Absolutely stunning, right? And as a result, there's all these little details mixed in that are really, really, really exciting. So this is a great overview for why you should check out the rest. Continue to check out my show. You should come back. You should listen, because frankly, hardly a week goes by that I don't learn something new that influences this story, right? Like, for example, in the past several weeks, I have been doing additional research into the other client kingdoms of Rome in the area. Judea wasn't the only one. There were others, and they play a role in the story. And guess what? They, of course, had their Game of Thrones going on too, right? The Roman client kingdom of Emesa, the Roman client kingdom of Nabatea. Okay, right? Not, oh my God, it's absolutely stunning what is going on, right? So to wrap up here, we got a few more minutes, but I want to kind of bring this all together. As a result, this 35 years of research has led to a lot of things, but you can go to my website and you can look for an article that is called Things That Should Not Be Forgotten. And Things That Should Not Be Forgotten is the 4 fundamental premises on which God Save the King is based. Because it took me 20 to 25 to 30 to 35 years to finally get to the place where I had learned enough that I could condense this and keep it manageable. Okay. So those 4 concepts, the 4 fundamental premises of God Save the King, premises, right, plural, right, is that number 1, Jesus was not born on December 25th. Number 2, tradition is not evidence. Okay. Number 3, the traditional version of the nativity story is rarely told in its historical context. And that's what we've been talking about today. And that number 4, the traditional nativity story is in fact Christian mythology. And that is largely because we have removed it from its Jewish context. Joseph was Jewish. Mary was Jewish. Jesus was Jewish. Everything they did would have attested to the fact that they were Jewish. The Nativity is a Jewish story. It is not a Christian story. It's not a Christian story. It's not the Christmas story. It's not the first Christmas. It's not the first Noel. It is a Jewish story. So if you want to read that article, okay, I also cover it in one of my other radio episodes, one of my YouTube videos. You can find it, Things That Should Not Be Forgotten. And then another great place for you to continue your, looking into this is that I talk about the 10 most common misconceptions that we get from the traditional nativity story. And of course, I don't have time to go through any of them right now. Okay. So let me just burn through the list to, once again, whet your appetite, okay, to continue listening to God Save the King and to check out my website, check out my YouTube page, and learn more about what the Nativity really would have looked like. So misconception number 1, the journey from Nazareth to Bethlehem was not hazardous, okay? It's frequently portrayed as a hazardous journey. It was not. Conception number 2, did Mary ride on a donkey? Okay, that's the one that I don't have time to go into right now, that I've actually gone back and forth about 3 or 4 different times. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter, but it's a ubiquitous part of the traditional story. They always have her on the back of a donkey, right? Arriving pregnant on the back of a donkey, and then she gives birth the same night. Sorry, guys, they traveled to Bethlehem when she was 4 months pregnant, not 9 months pregnant, okay? Right? No room in the inn. Jesus was not born in a stable. He was born in a traditional Judean home. Okay, so no room in the inn, Jesus born in a stable. Those are misconceptions. Jesus was not born the same night Joseph and Mary arrived in Bethlehem. That's an intrinsic part of most nativity stories. The wise men and the magi were not there at the same time. Pardon me, the wise men and the magi, listen to me. The shepherds and the magi were not there at the same time. They were there over a year apart, 15 months apart. Okay, the wise men weren't kings, and there weren't 3 of them. There was a boatload, many, many, many more. Enough that Scripture says that Herod was greatly troubled and all Jerusalem with him. So it was a large enough ambassadorial entourage to freak out Herod, right? Was Mary a virgin when Jesus was born? Oh boy, now there is one for people of all persuasions to get upset about. I just discussed that in other episodes. Was she a virgin when Jesus was born, right? Okay, I won't give you the answer tonight. The nativity story, is it the Christmas story? Okay, well, I've already made it very clear that it's not. Okay, but let's talk about that. Let's talk about the reverse engineering that results in us referring to the Nativity as the first Christmas. And that is intellectually dishonest. It is deceptive. It is just all wrong to reverse engineer this and to try to look backwards through a viewfinder of 2,000 years of Christian tradition and try to make the nativity look a certain way because it fits your tradition, right? When that's not what the Bible teaches us that happens. And of course, Jesus was not born on December 25th. And let's take a good hard look at that. How did we get that? Where did we get that from? And there's a variety of different theories why we arrived at the December 25th birth date. And the irony is that virtually none of them, right? And you can document this historically. Because first off, no one said a word about Jesus's birth for about 200 years after he was born. You find no historical record of any kind talking about his birthday for about 200 years. So it was just silence, right? And then when it did pop up on the radar, ironically, the people who were trying to find his birthday weren't looking at the Gospels to try to determine when it happened. They were using different theories with regard to calculating, there's the right word, calculating when Jesus was born, right? And then, but the bottom line is that my belief, very simply, is the fact that the Magi arrived in December. And when the Magi arrived, as I indicated a little while ago, it says that it was significant enough that Herod was troubled and all Jerusalem with him. So it created a stir, right? So even though Jesus was not born at that time, he was 15 months old at that time. That's what everybody remembers. That's what was in everybody's memory. So that's why they looked at late December and went, ooh, he must have been born in late December. See? And then Herod kills the slaughter of the innocents, kills all the male children. See, 2 years old and younger, though, right? Okay. At that time, but 2 years, right? See, so everybody goes, oh, yeah, we must have been born about 2 years ago in December, right? Right. Not realizing that Herod was adding a margin for error. Okay. But there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for listening to God Save the King on the Truth Be Told radio network. You can hear me every Friday night at 10 p.m. at TBTRN. So go to truthbetoldnetwork.org and click on the big listen button. Say, hey, Alexa, listen to Truth Be Told Radio Network. Or, hey, Google, listen to Truth Be Told Radio Network. My name is Tim Keyes. I am the host of God Save the King. Thank you for joining us, and I look forward to you joining us again. God Save the King.